They laughed when the deaf bride fell to her knees in the church, but before sunset, the same town would beg her to forgive them. New Mexico Territory, 1878. Inside the sunlit chapel of Silver Creek, 100 faces watched Clara Wynn's wedding not with warmth, but hunger for humiliation. Her husband-to-be, Abel Crane, the banker's spoiled son, stood tall and smug, savoring every second. When the preacher asked for his vow, Abel's smile turned venomous. "I can't marry a woman who can't even hear her own name," he said. Laughter erupted. Clara froze, her pale hands trembling, bouquet slipping from her grasp. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the twisted joy on their lips, the pleasure of cruelty. Her world spun, the stained glass burning around her like a cage of color and shame. And then, a shadow crossed the aisle. The heavy doors slammed open, and dust from the desert rolled in with him. Luke Merritt, a rancher known more for his gun than his grace. Without a word, he stepped between her and the mob, his voice sharp as steel. "She's worth more than every coward in this room." What began as a wedding meant to humiliate a broken girl would end as a legend, a story of love born from silence and defended by fire. The town of Silver Creek sat crouched between red cliffs and endless desert, an outpost of greed and gossip carved from dust and pride. In late summer, the air shimmered like a forge, bending light over the steeple of the whitewashed church. The wedding had ended in disgrace, yet its echoes lingered across the streets like a bad hymn no one could forget. Outside, the wind pushed through the alleys, scattering flower petals and torn ribbons. Clara Wynn walked barefoot down the steps, her veil dragging through the dirt. Her eyes gray like stormlight, held neither tears nor fury, only the hollow calm of someone who had already lost everything. Around her, whispers followed. Poor girl. Deaf girl. Foolish girl. She didn't need to hear them to know their meaning. From the saloon porch across the square, Luke Merritt watched her. His hat shaded a face roughened by sun and battle, eyes dark with something unspoken. Once a soldier, now a rancher who kept to himself, Luke carried the quiet weight of men who'd seen too much death and not enough mercy. He hadn't meant to interfere at the church, but when he saw her fall, something inside him moved. Something that refused to stay still. That night, thunder rolled over the desert. The storm cracked open the sky, drenching the town that had laughed at her. In that darkness, beneath the lightning's white roar, Luke saddled his horse. He had no reason to go back, but he did. And by dawn, Clara Wynn would wake under a stranger's roof, in a home where silence might finally be something sacred, not shameful. Subscribe for more Western love stories where hearts find hope in the dust. Clara woke to the crackle of fire and the scent of pine smoke. Her dress was still damp from the storm, her hair loose around her face. A rough blanket covered her, heavy and warm. For a moment, she didn't move, unsure whether this was mercy or another cruel joke. Then she saw the man by the hearth. Luke Merritt, the stranger from the church, sat sharpening a knife, the edge flashing in the firelight. He noticed her stirring and rose, slow and steady, as if approaching a frightened animal. He pointed to the cup of water beside her, then to himself, his hand moving in a simple gesture. Safe. Clara stared, uncertain if she should believe it. He didn't speak again. He simply poured more coffee into his tin cup and turned back to the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the shutters. Luke's cabin was small, rough-hewn logs, rifle over the mantel, saddle by the door. A life of solitude hung in the air like dust. Yet it wasn't loneliness she felt. It was stillness, the first she'd known in months. Later, when she tried to stand, her knees buckled. He caught her before she fell. His hands, calloused but careful, held her steady for just a breath too long. Their eyes met hers, full of questions, his full of restraint. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought burned behind his gaze. No one deserves to be left like that, not even her. And that was the moment it began, the choice he could not undo, the bond he never meant to forge. The days that followed passed like smoke over dry land, slow, silent, and heavy, with something neither of them could name. Luke Merritt was a man of few words, but Clara Wynn didn't need words to read him. Every movement spoke, the way he rolled his shoulders after a long ride, the cautious gentleness when he set down a cup near her, the faint tension that lived in his jaw each time thunder rumbled outside. She learned to move through his cabin quietly, as if afraid to disturb a life that wasn't hers. In the mornings, she swept the porch. At dusk, she lit the fire. Luke didn't stop her. He only watched, pretending not to notice that the woman once left broken on a church floor now walked with a steadier spine. Yet Silver Creek hadn't forgotten. The story of the deaf bride and the outlaw rancher spread faster than wildfire in the desert wind. Some called Luke a fool, others, worse, a man harboring a shame he mistook for charity. And Abel Crane, humiliated and drunk on vengeance, carried both names on his tongue like poison. It began with whispers. Then came riders seen near Luke's landmen wearing Crane's brand, lurking where the fences ended. Luke noticed first. Horses tracked through the lower canyon, boot prints by the creek. He said nothing to Clara, but his hand rested longer on his colt whenever he went outside. She sensed it anyway. Even without sound, she could read the world in motion, the unease in his steps, the tightening of his shoulders, the shadow that followed every dawn. One evening, while Luke repaired a fence post under a bleeding sky, she brought him water. Her skirt fluttered in the hot wind, her hair caught in the dying light. He looked up, sweat tracing a scar along his temple. She mouthed a word he could barely understand. Danger? He froze. Then, quietly, he nodded. That night, Luke sat at the table, sketching a crude map of the canyon while Clara watched from across the room. She wished she could ask, "Why are they coming? What will you do?" But she couldn't form the words, and he couldn't answer the ones she never spoke. Instead, he drew a circle around the lower ridge, then tapped his chest knee and pointed to the cabin U. Her hands tightened around her skirt. He saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear that once made her collapse in the church. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers, and with deliberate care, traced letters against her palm. Safe. Something broke inside her, not from fear, but from trust. The next day, Luke rode into town. He found Abel Crane in front of the saloon, laughing with his father's men. "You stay off my land," Luke warned. Abel smiled, tipping his hat. "Or what? You'll shoot me like the hero you pretend to be?" Luke didn't blink. "If I have to." The laughter died. The rancher's voice carried like iron through dust. "That woman you threw away," he said. "She deserves better than a coward's son." Abel's grin faltered. He spat, eyes burning. "She's deaf, Merritt. You can't save what's already broken." Luke's jaw clenched. "You're right, but I can damn sure stop you from breaking her again." They stared each other down until a deputy stepped between them. Luke left first, but Abel's voice followed him down the street. "You'll regret this, soldier boy. The desert eats men like you alive." By the time Luke returned home, the sun had fallen, and Clara was waiting by the gate, worry etched across her face. He dismounted, dusted off his hat, and smiled faintly. She reached for his sleeve, her eyes asking what words couldn't. He signed slowly, clumsy but sincere. Trouble coming. That night, the sky turned red at the horizon, smoke thin, distant, but real. Luke's cattle scattered near the ridge. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted out. Clara followed him to the porch, gripping the post, eyes wide. 3 riders appeared over the hill, torches in hand, laughter faint but cruel. Luke shouted, fired a warning shot into the air. The echo rolled through the canyon like thunder. The riders answered with bullets. One struck the fence post beside Clara, shattering wood into splinters. Luke turned, shouting something she couldn't hear probably. "Get inside." But she didn't move. Fear pinned her where she stood. Then his hand reached her, pushing her through the door just as another shot rang out. The next moment's blurred firelight, shouts, the smell of burning hay. Luke fired from the window, reloading in rhythm, his face grim and steady. Clara crouched behind the table, trembling. Each flash of gunfire painted the walls red. Then a sharp cry. Luke staggered, clutching his shoulder. The rifle clattered. He fell to one knee, blood darkening his sleeve. Clara crawled toward him, shaking. He tried to wave her back, but she refused. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it to the wound. His breath hitched. He looked up, teeth gritted, eyes meeting hers. She couldn't hear his pain, but she could feel it in the tremor of his muscles beneath her palms. Outside, hoofbeats retreated into the night. The attackers were gone for now. Luke exhaled, slumping against the wall. "They'll be back," he muttered, half to himself. Clara didn't understand, but she saw the fear behind his strength. She reached for his slate board, the one he used to write. Her hands trembled as she scrawled, "Why help me? Why risk your life?" Luke hesitated, staring at the question. Then he took the chalk, his handwriting jagged. "Because you reminded me there's something left worth saving." She froze, the words cut deeper than any bullet. For the first time since her world went silent, Clara felt something louder than sound hope. For 3 days, the wind didn't rest. Luke's wound worsened, fever set in. Clara did what she could, cleaned, stitched, prayed in the quiet way of those who don't believe prayer works but try anyway. When he awoke, weak but alive, he found her asleep beside the bed, her hand resting on his arm as if guarding him from ghosts. He didn't move, just watched her, sunlight spilling across her hair. The next morning, they buried one of his burned horses. Luke stood bareheaded, silent, while Clara placed a wildflower at the grave. She turned to him, her eyes saying what her voice could not. "We survived." But peace, in Silver Creek, never lasted. Abel Crane returned with more men armed, furious, determined to make Luke pay. By then, Clara had learned enough from his gestures to understand danger. She hid in the cellar when they came, clutching his revolver, though her hands shook violently. The sound of horses, shouts, gunfire, she felt it through the floorboards, each vibration a drumbeat of chaos. Then came silence, too long, too empty. Her pulse roared in her ears. She climbed the steps, cracked the door open. Smoke curled through the cabin. Luke stood at the doorway, blood streaked down his temple, rifle empty. One of Abel's men lunged from the side. Clara didn't think she moved. She raised the revolver, aimed through the haze, and fired. The recoil slammed through her arms. The man fell. Luke turned, stunned, then met her gaze. For a moment, the world stood still. The woman who couldn't hear had just saved his life by feeling the rhythm of violence itself. When the last gun was fired, and the last threat fled into the desert, Luke walked toward her, chest heaving, and took her face in his hands. He didn't speak. He just looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as broken, not as fragile, but as fierce. Later, as dawn bled over the ridge, they sat outside the ruined cabin, both covered in soot and silence. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver locket from her mother, the one she'd worn at the wedding that never was. She placed it in his hand. Inside was a faded sketch of a young woman, her smile barely visible. Beneath it, etched words, "Love speaks without sound." Luke closed his fist around it, then signed, slow and deliberate, "Always." And for the first time, she smiled, not the polite, practiced curve she wore for pity, but something real, wild, and alive. 3 days passed after the gunfight. The cabin smelled of gun oil and burned wood. Luke's shoulder was bandaged, his face pale but steady. Outside, the desert baked clean again, as if the storm of bullets had never come. But beneath that silence, something restless stirred, a truth he could no longer bury. Clara sensed it. She always did. He'd grown quieter, even for him. At dusk, she found him sitting on the porch, staring toward the far ridge where the horizon bled into gold. His hands, rough and scarred, turned the silver locket over and over, the metal flashing in the dying light. When she touched his arm, he flinched. Not from pain, but memory. She tilted her head, questioning. He met her eyes, then reached for the slate board resting beside him. Slowly he wrote, "You should know what kind of man you saved." She frowned, confused. He hesitated, chalk, trembling. Then the truth spilled out in jagged words. "I wasn't just a soldier. I was a bounty man. I hunted men for money. Once, I brought in your father." Clara froze. The world seemed to tilt. She took the board, reading the words twice, as if disbelief might change them. Her lips parted, trembling not from fear, but shock. Luke looked away. "He was wanted for robbery," he said softly, "but he died before trial. I never knew he had a daughter, not until that day in the church." Her breath came sharp. Images from childhood flared behind her eyes, men shouting, her father's hands covered in dust, the night she lost her hearing to a blast of gunfire. She had never known who fired that shot. Until now. Tears welled, burning hot trails down her cheeks. She stumbled back a step, clutching the porch post. Luke stood, pain in every movement. "Clara," he said, voice low, desperate. "I didn't mean—" She shook her head violently, hands flying, signing with fury. He didn't understand every word, but he caught the meaning. "Go, leave me." He stepped closer. She slapped the slate board to his chest and ran inside, slamming the door. Luke didn't follow. He sank to the porch steps, staring at the dust. For the first time in years, the man who had faced bandits in war felt something worse than fear, remorse. That night, she packed her small bag. The moon was high, the desert silver. Luke slept fitfully by the fire, fever and guilt twisting through his dreams. She stood in the doorway, watching him. The man who had saved her, who had given her safety and silence, was the same man who had taken everything from her long ago. She turned and left. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying sand like whispers. She walked toward the hills, guided only by the moon. By dawn, she had crossed the dry creek bed and vanished into the desert. When Luke woke, the house was empty. Her shawl still hung on the chair. The locket, her mother's locket, was gone. He didn't curse or call out. He simply stood there, the truth heavy as chains around his neck. Then he saddled his horse, tightened his bandage, and rode out. By noon, he reached the edge of Dead Horse Canyon, the wind hot enough to burn breath. He saw tracks, small boots, light steps headed toward the south ridge. But they weren't the only ones. Fresh hoof prints cut across hers, deeper, heavier. He knew that pattern. Abel Crane's men. Luke spurred his horse forward, heart pounding. Every beat echoed the same thought. I won't lose her. Not again. He found her near sundown, cornered between boulders and the open plain. Abel Crane sat astride his chestnut mare, 6 men fanning out around him. His grin was feral. You made it easy for me, Merritt. The girl just walked right into my arms. Clara stood behind a rock, clutching her bag, her face streaked with dust and fear. Luke reined in, eyes locked on Abel. Let her go. Abel laughed. After what she cost me? After what you did to my men? No, rancher. Today, I take everything from you like you took from me. He raised his gun. Luke dismounted slowly, hands open, moving between Clara and the barrel aimed her way. This isn't between her and you. Abel's smirk deepened. Oh, it's always about her. The town pitied her, you defended her, and now she's the reason you'll die. The moment cracked like lightning. Gunfire exploded across the rocks. Luke rolled behind a boulder, returning fire. Dust plumed. Clara crouched, heart pounding, unable to hear but feeling every vibration of chaos through the ground. Bullets sparked against stone. Then she saw it, one of Abel's men flanking from the ridge, taking aim at Luke's blind side. Her body moved before thought did. She grabbed a jagged rock and hurled it. It struck the man's wrist. The shot went wide. Luke turned, caught sight of her, and shouted something she couldn't hear. But she didn't need sound to understand. It was the same plea as always. Stay down. He rose from cover, fired twice. 2 men fell. Then a third shot tore through his side. He dropped to one knee. Abel advanced, smiling wide. You can't save her this time. But Clara was already moving. She rushed to Luke, grabbing his revolver, her fingers shaking. Abel's laughter filled the air, mocking, cruel, triumphant. She doesn't even know which end fires. Luke's bloodied hand covered hers. He guided her grip, steadying it, their eyes locking. She felt the rhythm of his pulse through his touch, steady, strong, resolute. He nodded once. She aimed, fired. The bullet struck Abel's hat, tearing it from his head. His horse reared, throwing him into the dust. He scrambled up, furious, lunging for his rifle, but Luke was faster. He fired once, clean and cold. Abel fell, the desert swallowing his last breath. Silence returned. Not the cruel silence of pity or fear, but one carved by survival and choice. Clara dropped the gun, falling to her knees beside Luke. His face was pale, blood dark on his shirt. She pressed her hands to the wound, panic rising. He smiled faintly, lips barely moving. "Guess you saved me again," he whispered. She shook her head, tears falling fast. She mouthed a single word, "Why?" His gaze softened. "Because I owed you the truth." She pulled the locket from her pocket and placed it back into his hand. He looked at it, then at her. She signed, slow and deliberate. Not forgiveness, but maybe understanding. Luke's eyes glistened. He touched her hand and traced against her palm. "Live." Hours later, when the lawmen from Silver Creek arrived, they found Abel Crane's body half buried in dust, his gun empty, and 2 survivors leaning against each other beneath the fading light. By the time they returned to town, the story had already spread. Some called Luke a murderer, others a hero, but Clara didn't care. She sat beside his bed for days, nursing him again, her hand never leaving his. When he woke, the first thing he saw was her smile, not full, not healed, but real. And when she finally spoke with her hands, signing carefully so he would understand, the words were simple. "You lost your peace the day you met me." He smiled weakly. "No, I found it." Outside, the sky flamed orange over Silver Creek. The town that once mocked them now stood silent each time they passed. Their whispers turned to respect. But the quiet between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of forgiveness, fire, and a love that had survived both betrayal and blood. Subscribe for more Western love stories where hearts find hope in the dust. Spring came late to Silver Creek that year. The desert thawed slow, as if testing whether it was safe to bloom again. Rain washed away the bloodstains from the canyon, and the scent of sage returned to the wind. Luke Merritt healed slowly. The bullets had taken more than flesh, they'd taken strength. He spent weeks in bed, drifting between sleep and fever, always waking to find Clara beside him. She never left, never faltered. When he tried to speak, she shook her head gently, as if to say, "Rest. You've said enough." One morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains, bright and warm. Luke stirred and found her sitting by the window, sketching in a worn notebook, the same one he'd once used for maps and bounty marks. Now, her fingers moved gracefully, drawing the outline of a hand, then another beneath it. When she noticed him awake, she smiled faintly and turned the page toward him. In her neat handwriting, she had written, "You gave me a place to be heard." Luke stared at the words for a long moment, then reached for his chalkboard. His letters came rough but sure. "You gave me a reason to stop running." The air between them softened. No apology, no grand promise, just truth. When he was strong enough to walk again, they rebuilt what the fire and bullets had ruined. The cabin's charred walls became something new: clean wood, wide windows, and a porch where the evening light could spill without shame. Clara planted flowers around the steps, white and yellow, bright as the hope she refused to let die. But she wanted more than healing. She wanted purpose. One afternoon she found Luke hammering fence boards and motioned for him to follow. She led him to the old barn, cleared of smoke and dust. Inside, she'd set up a few benches, a chalkboard, and a line of books she'd salvaged from town. On the wall hung a small hand-carved sign that read, "The Listening School." Luke raised an eyebrow. She grinned, then signed, her movements steady and proud. "For children like me. For silence that means strength, not shame." He watched her, chest tight. Then, without a word, he reached out, took her hands, and signed back slow, deliberate, but perfectly clear, "I'll help you build it." And he did. By summer, the barn echoed with laughter, not the kind she could hear, but the kind she could feel through the rhythm of feet, the vibration of joy against the wooden floorboards. Children from nearby farms came, some deaf, some simply curious, and Clara taught them all. She showed them how to speak with their hands, how to listen with their hearts. Luke stood beside her, translating when needed, protecting always. The townsfolk began to visit too. The same men and women who once mocked her at the church now watched in awe as she spoke through movement, every gesture a sermon without words. Even Sheriff Danner, once skeptical, tipped his hat one evening and said, "Didn't think silence could teach this much." Luke smiled. "You just had to listen the right way." When the first harvest moon rose, they held a small gathering outside the barn. No priest, no ceremony, just neighbors, children, and the soundless language of gratitude. Luke stood beside Clara as she signed her speech, each motion deliberate and radiant in the torchlight. The world took my hearing but gave me sight. It took my voice but gave me hands. It took my peace but gave me him. She turned to Luke, her eyes shimmering. He reached for her hand, tracing words into her palm. Home. The crowd clapped, a storm of applause rolling through the night. Clara didn't need to hear it. She saw it in their faces, in the way they leaned forward, changed. Later, after the others had gone, she and Luke sat on the porch. The desert stretched before them wide, quiet, infinite. The air smelled of sage and cedar smoke. She rested her head on his shoulder, signing lazily into the dusk. "Do you still dream of the war?" He paused, then signed back. "Not since you taught me how to listen again." And together they sat there, saying nothing more, while the wind whispered through the valley the kind of silence that heals, not haunts. Years later, the legend of Clara Wynn and Luke Merritt had grown roots in Silver Creek. Folks told their story in hushed tones around campfires and over whiskey glasses, the deaf bride who was betrayed before God, and the gunslinger who chose her not out of pity, but defiance. Children who once hid behind their parents' legs now ran laughing to the old barn, their hands flying in silent conversation. The listening school had become the heart of the valley, a place where silence wasn't loneliness but language, where the quiet ones finally had a voice. Clara aged with grace, her hair silvering like morning frost, her smile soft but sure. Luke stayed the same in spirit, slower perhaps, but unbroken. The scar on his shoulder still ached when it rained, and sometimes, at dusk, he'd sit on the porch, watching the sky burn orange and gold, tracing old words into the air. Safe, home, peace. Every evening, before the sun slipped behind the ridge, Clara would join him. She'd rest her hand over his, feel the roughness of his palm, and sign slowly. "Still listening?" He'd smile, that quiet half-grin that belonged only to her. Always, he'd sign back. One autumn morning, Luke didn't rise with the dawn. He sat in his chair, hat tilted low, a faint smile frozen on his lips, the world finally quiet around him. Clara found him there, hands still resting on the railing, as if feeling the pulse of the land one last time. She didn't cry. She simply took his hand and pressed it to her heart. Weeks later, she carved 2 words into the cedar of the porch rail, where he used to sit, still listening. When she passed years after, they buried her beside him beneath the cottonwood tree, where the wind forever whispered through the leaves. The school kept running, carried on by the children they'd taught, the silence they'd sanctified, and travelers who passed through Silver Creek swore that when the wind hit the canyon just right, you could almost hear them not in sound, but in feeling, 2 souls speaking softly in the language they built from silence and love. Because out here in the West, words fade fast in the dust. But the quiet ones, the ones who listen, they live forever. Subscribe for more Western love stories where hearts find hope in the dust.